Hello and welcome to another episode of Back to Britpop. It's me, Chris. On this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Wesley Doyle of the band Pimlico. Wesley goes into great detail about how the band were formed, those early gigs, getting a record deal, and lots of other fantastic stories and anecdotes from his time in a 90s indie Britpop band. And it's great to hear a different kind of perspective on that era. So I really appreciate Wesley giving up his time to speak to me. As per usual, I'll be back at the end of the interview to talk about all the ways that you can support the podcast. But let's get cracking with the interview. So here's Wesley. Welcome to the podcast, Wesley Doyle. How are you?
Hi, Chris. I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on. I'm a big fan of the podcast and going back and listening to old episodes and been really enjoying it.
We were talking a little bit off mic then about what you've been up to, and I always like to ask the dreaded question as well about the last sort of 12 months and things and how it's affected the guests that have been on the podcast. But have you kind of kindled any sort of interests or anything, or you kept busy?
Well, I'm a freelance writer, editor. So initially, no, not really. I think it's I tend to work myself, and I work from home mostly. I was doing some commercial work that took me abroad, and obviously that stopped pretty quickly. So yeah, I was just at home doing what I do. I think I guess it does make you look inwards a little bit and sort of assess what it is you want to do with your work and what you can do. But on a day-to-day basis, it hasn't really changed that much. I think it has for my kids more than me. I think they're getting sick of the sight of me, I think.
Yeah. Obviously, we're here to talk about Pimlico.
Yes.
And before we touch on sort of how it all started and kind of where you see yourself sitting in the sort of 90s Britpop and indie scene, what was it like for you growing up with music, and how did you kind of know that you wanted to pursue music at an early age, or if you did at all?
Well, my parents had me quite young, so I was born in the end of 1968. So I kind of grew up in the 70s listening to the music they liked, and they had quite good taste. I mean, they used to listen to Neil Young and David Bowie, Elton John, Kate Bush, Joni Mitchell. So I kind of grew up in a house with a lot of really good music. So when it came to be my turn to sort of start imposing my own taste upon them, it was quite difficult really, because I'd listened to all the stuff that people class as classics. But I mean, I was a kid of the 80s, so I was a pop kid really. So Adam and the Ants, Toyah, Duran Duran, Terence Trent D'Arby, Julian Cope, The Cure, all that kind of stuff. I loved all that stuff, and I never really wanted to be a musician. I mean, I'm a rudimentary guitarist at best, but I think I just wanted to be a pop star. I just sort of looked at those people and thought, yeah, that would be a good thing to do.
So when did you think the ball started to drop in terms of you thinking this could be something you wanted to pursue, and maybe getting down to some sort of songwriting?
Well, I used to work in a record shop. That was like the first job that I had. And there was a guy in the record shop who he had his own bands, and he was a musician and would make his own demos, and he used to bring them in to play to the shop in the shop. And that was the first time I made a connection that normal people could make music. Yeah, I mean, because as far as the people I used to see on TV, it was like they'd been beamed down from Mars or something, and it was this amazing talent they had that normal people didn't have. So I guess I was about 17 or 18, I think, and that was the first time I'd met somebody who could make music, and then I'd sort of set about trying to find people who would facilitate that and wouldn't mind me shouting over the top. So it was like trial and error. I was in plenty of horrendously named and horrendously sounding bands throughout the kind of 80s and early 90s.
In terms of being a frontman then, I mean, lots of the guests that I've had on the podcast and just people in general, singers in general, say that they put on this kind of persona. And I guess that it does benefit having the ability to do that. Was that something that you kind of would try to do as well?
Yeah, it was Dutch courage, really. I mean, I used to be quite shy. I mean, but Yeah, I mean, it was just. I remember the first gig I ever did. It was quite a big. I played quite a big venue at. It was the Square in Harlow, which was like a really nice venue. It's not there anymore, but it was. It had a really good PA, and there were a lot of people there. And I remember just having to almost like self-talk to myself in the mirror, sort of, because I was so terrified. But I think once I did it the first time, and then I came on stage, and there was such a massive buzz. That kind of outweighed any sort of nerves that I had. But I think as I got more, as you play more and more bands, and you start, to do showcases, and you're trying to attract the attention of labels and that, I think a certain amount of sort of persona building sort of comes into it. I mean, the thing with Pimlico was I had a very definite job to do in Pimlico, and what I did in the band reflected that.
And so you approached these guys that were already established in like a three-piece and said, I can sing for you and take you somewhere in a different direction. And how did that come about?
Well, I mean, we all come from Hertfordshire, even though the band's called Pimlico. Pete Twyman, the guitarist, Andy Lewis, bass player. They're from Watford, and Miles Chapman, the drummer, and I are from kind of North Hart. So they were in a band called The Upshot in the late 80s, and they were kind of like a power pop band in the same ballpark as 5:30 and Boys Wonder. And they used to regularly win Gary Crowley's demo clash on GLR radio. And they always had people, scouts going to see them play, and A&R people, but they never sort of managed to get a deal. And as I said, I'd been playing around with sort of lots of other bands with similar lack of success. But it was a little scene, and we all supported each other. We go and see each other play, and we were all friends. And I think, Andy was and still is like a very well-respected DJ, and I'd go and to hit the clubs that he would play at, like Wendy May's Locomotion, and he was starting up this new club called Blow Up that was based in Camden, a place called the Laurel Tree. This would be about 1993, the end of 93. And by that point, I was a big fan of Suede and Pulp and the Auteurs, and I really wanted to get that kind of band together. But a lot of people I knew were much more into sort of grunge and rock. So I basically turned to them and said, I've seen you play, you're really good, but you need a focus, you need a front man. I'll join your band and sing your songs. And that was kind of it, really. And
what was their initial reaction? Was it positive? I mean, or did they sort of look at you and think, hang on a minute, who's this guy?
To me in horror and said, yeah, only if you get your hair cut, I think was what they said. But no, I think it was, I think, we were in our early 20s. We'd been around the block a few times. I mean, for me, there was definitely a sense of last roll of the dice. I mean, I'd been in bands for 7 or 8 years and not really got anywhere. And I had an option of going to university in my back pocket. I'd been deferring a place at university for about 10 years or something. Maybe not that long, but yeah, I mean, it was kind of, I mean, my thing was like, I'll let's go out, let's play for a year, and then I'm off to university. But yeah, it didn't quite work out that way.
And those sort of early sort of rehearsals you were doing and sort of sessions that when you were kind of trying to find your own feet and sound, I mean, what were they like? Did you kind of realize that you were onto something in terms of the sound, or did it take a lot of work?
Well, it was quite simple, really. I mean, I think like I suggested doing that, and then Pete came forward with a bunch of demos that he'd done of some new songs that he'd recorded that he didn't really have anywhere to put them, and we listened to the demos and we thought, yeah, they're great. So we just played those. I mean, I think the first gig we did, we only had about 6 songs. So, we just did those and then did them again, I think. Yeah. But it was I'd like to sort of stress that they were quite well formed. They had everything going for them. Like Pete is a really good songwriter. Andy's a really good songwriter. It was just, they just didn't seem to be getting anywhere. And I could see, like when I used to go and see them play, I was thinking like, you kind of need an Adamant or a Julian Cope up front. That would be, that would really take them to the next level. And thankfully they agreed with that.
And so you kind of got success quite quickly then in terms of like getting A&R guys that coming to gigs and a little bit of interest, which is kind of what everyone really wants deep down, even if they say they're not doing it for the recognition. But what that must have been pretty exciting at the time.
Yeah, it was, but it's also, there was also an element of like, okay, it was about time.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, I think, even though it happened quickly for that band, there had been, sort of like 6 or 7 years leading up to it when we'd all been spectacularly unsuccessful. So I think like when it happened, it was like, okay, right, so this is where we need to be. And it was great. I mean, I think because we were a little bit older, maybe, sort of about 22, 23, it was, we were a bit more measured about it. I think we could take a step back and think, okay, so let's not get too ahead of ourselves. And we were a little bit more, we weren't cynical about it, but I think we were just a little bit more grown up about it, maybe.
But in terms of like generating that sort of live following, which is kind of what every band is hungry for, did you have a trusty fan base?
I mean, it was already there, really. I mean, I can't underestimate sort of Andy's connections with Blow Up, really. I mean, he and Paul Tunkin, who founded Blow Up, had been the DJs on Blur's Part Life tour, and by the time by the time the Ali Pali gig came around in October, I mean, it was just, like Britpop was there, wasn't it? It was just, Menswear had appeared from nowhere, and it was just, there was like a ready-made audience, really. And we started playing at Blow Up, like the first few gigs, or I think our second or third gig was at Blow Up, and they used to have bands playing in the corner. And I mean, even though it was still quite a small thing, it could have been more than 100 people there or something. They were just looking for new bands that could fulfil that promise of the club, really. And we were quite closely aligned to the club, like for better or worse. The people who went to the club would come and see us play when we played out. So yeah, like getting people to come see us wasn't really a problem in London, at least. I think when we started playing outside of London, that was a slightly different story.
Because you say you didn't technically tour, but you did plenty of gigs. Well, you did as many gigs as you possibly could in and around the country. So did you struggle to get gigs outside of London, or was it something that just because of what was happening at the time and so London centric, it didn't seem as important? Yeah,
I mean, I think it took a while for Britpop, for want of a better word, to kind of percolate outside of London. I mean, it was a very London-centric thing, and I think I mean there were kind of pockets, like Brighton Beach up in Leeds, which was an incredible Britpop club. I mean, if you went up there, people were even more rabid than they were in London, mainly because they didn't have that kind of sort of capital city call that people seem to think they need to have in London. But there were quite a few little pockets around the country, and we would normally go and play on a Britpop night, or we would go and support another band that we knew who were sort of playing. So we played like Bath Moles Club and the Road Menders, and all those kind of sort of like smaller venues. And we'd either, Andy would either DJ after we played, or would be playing on their own Britpop night. So that's kind of how we did it. I mean, we never signed to a promoter, so we didn't have somebody sort of saying to us, this is the best way to go around the country. We would like zigzag across, clocking up hundreds of miles and making absolutely no money. But it didn't really seem to matter. I mean, we just liked going out and playing, really. It was what we wanted to do, and it was why we started doing it. So it wasn't a problem. You signed to a small indie label, and then was everything sort of record ready essentially at that point? Well, I mean, we rehearsed so much. I mean, I think one thing I will say about us as a live band is that we were really, really tight. We it was essentially a 3-piece with a singer, so they had that kind of power pop, power trio thing going. So we were like a very tight band. Like Pete, Andy, and Miles have been playing together probably at that point for about 10 years maybe. So they were really in simpatico, and we just as soon as we had an opportunity to go into a studio, as you say, it was a small label called Vinyl Japan, who are a kind of Japanese label that set up an office in London. And they didn't have much money, and they didn't want to spend any money, so they kind of chucked us in the studio. I think the first EP was kind of done. I think it was done over like 2 days or something. I recorded 4 songs in 2 days, and we just like went in and just sort of like banged them out. And they sounded how we sounded live, with a couple of overdubs and some backing vocals, really.
Off of that first release, or their first EP, you started to get some decent radio play as well, or had that already been happening before that, or had you like managed to get your foot in the door on some of the radio stations and things?
Not really. I mean, again, it was something that just kind of happened. I mean, we had things like a press agent and a plugger kind of later on, but for that first single, it just I just remember like somebody said to me that they'd heard us on the radio on the evening session. So obviously you couldn't go back and listen to it again or anything. So we just had to sort of sit in front of the radio every evening, just hoping that it would be played again. And it was. And then it was played on Radio 1. I think Kevin Greening played it on Radio 1, and then Radio 2. And it was like, it had nothing to do with us really. It was just like all of a sudden people started playing it, and that was down to like Joe Wiley and Steve Mac, really.
It's funny, isn't it? You would think that they would try and find a way to contact you first to let you know that you're being played on the radio, because nowadays you kind of get that pre kind of promotional kind of notification to say that you can you get people to listen in. And I suppose in those days you just had to wing it in terms of being
and I can't sort of stress how useless the record label was in the nicest possible way. I mean, they were used to putting out these kind of freak beat compilations and albums by former members of Gal and Drunk, and to have a band who's being played on Radio 1, they didn't know what to do really. It was I think they were as surprised as we were, and panicked.
You got to sort of record with some great producers as well. What was that like? Did you have like a wish list of people you wanted to work with?
Yeah, producers wise, I think, John McLaughlin, who we worked with on the first couple of EPs, he was Thurman's producer, and we'd done some shows with Thurman, and we'd met John, and he was up for doing something with us, and more importantly, he was quite cheap. Which was important for the record label. But no, he was great. I mean, his career, unfortunately he's no longer with us, but he was in the Rehearsals, he played for Della Mitri. He was like a proper sort of session player. He'd been around the block a few times, and he had a guy called Charlie Francis who engineered for him, co-produced with him, and Charlie had been in Toyah's band back in the early 80s, and he'd worked with REM and all sorts of people, they were just really great. They'd seen it all, and and they were quite cynical, so we quite liked that.
Did they let you do your thing, or were they, in terms of producing you, what kind of support did they offer?
Not much really. I mean, I think I think because of the amount of money we had and the speed at which things were done, I think they just came in and treated it as if they were just recording a band live, really. I think as things progressed, especially when we came to do the album with them later, we started being a little bit more experimental, for better or for worse. But for those first 2 EPs, it was just like get the tracks down, get them out. I'm quite fond of those first 2 EPs, because they were the first things that we did as that band. But I think the third EP we did, the sort of Bubbles EP, we decided to go with Pat Collier. I mean, we had a list of people we wanted to work with, and Andy Partridge was one of them, and Pat Collier was another. And I think both of them agreed to do it, but I think we were a bit sort of wary of Andy Partridge because I think he produced Blur or some early demos for Modern Life is Rubbish, and we were always getting compared to Blur, not in a good way either. so we thought, well, if we go with Andy Partridge, then we're just sort of playing into people's hands. So we thought we'd go with Pat instead. But I mean, Pat had worked with Boys Wonder and House of Love and Voice of the Beehive, so that was all sort of like late 80s, early 90s stuff that I loved. I loved the sound of those records. So and I love the record we did with Pat. I think it's the best thing we did personally.
And then you got some an opportunity to do a pop video, which is another a milestone in any band's wish list, I'm guessing. But you struggled to get that done, I'm guessing, in time from what I read.
It was a couple of weeks after our first EP was released, and the chart show got in touch with our label asking for a video because they'd put it in quite high in their independent chart. I don't remember the chart show on Saturday mornings. They would show little clips of videos, and they had their own. They had like a dance chart and an indie chart and a soul chart. And we'd gone into their independent chart, and they wanted a video, and obviously we didn't have a video. Record label just aghast that they might have to pay for one. So they did eventually find some money like down the back of the sofa for like a live video. So we were gonna they were gonna come and film us playing in a club, and they found a production company based in London. So we just basically had to hastily arrange a gig for them to come and film, but unfortunately we had to do it after we had a bunch of dates booked, like 3 dates. Couldn't have been further away from each other. So we headlined the Marquee on the Wednesday, I think, and then we drove up to Bath to support Thurman at the Moles Club, and then from there we drove up to Leeds to play Brighton Beach, the Britpop club in the Arches up there. Mm-hmm. And then the next day we had to drive back to Hertfordshire, where we'd arranged this gig so they could come and film us. And so I think then we did about 600 miles, I think, over 4 days. And we were absolutely knackered by the time we got to do the video. We were just shattered, but we were kind of on a roll, and it was we got it done, and they played it on the chart show, and it was played a few times. I think it was on MTV 120 Minutes, and on the Big E, do you remember that program, late night TV show on ITV? We got it done, but as with everything with Pimlico, it was done on the cheap, and we put it in by the skin of our teeth.
You had another sort of anecdote that I was reading earlier on about drinking it before gigs and things like that. Is there something every kind of musician learns a lesson in terms of alcohol consumption? And were you boozers before gigs? Was it for Dutch courage, or was it just sometimes just because of the work that you were doing?
It was only really Pete and I who drank, because we didn't drive. I'm happy to say I do drive now, but but it just didn't, it didn't seem important to drive back then. But I mean, it was just one of those things. It was, whenever you play these kind of small shows, invariably, you're playing in a club that has a bar, or you're playing in a pub that has a room out the back, and you go there and you've got a sound check at 5, 6 o'clock, and you're not on till 9, half 9. And there's a lot of time to kill. And I don't think we had the self-discipline to keep away from the bar. But after that particular, we played at the Marquee Cafe in Greek Street in Soho. You talking about that, the Graham Coxon?
Well, yes.
Yeah, but it's a bit. I guess I should add a caveat that obviously in light of Graham's struggles with alcohol, maybe the story isn't as funny as it was at the time. But we were playing at the Marquee Cafe, which is a venue that's not there anymore, on Greek Street in Soho. And we had to sound check at like 5 o'clock or something, and we weren't on till 10. So we decided to like nip over to Camden to go to the Good Mixer for a drink, and Graham was in there, and obviously Andy knows Graham from the Park Life tour. So we all got chatting, and when the time came for us to leave and go and do the gig, he decided to come along. Of course, when we got to the venue, he was absolutely mobbed. Like the Great Escape hadn't been out for long. Blur were like one of the biggest bands in the country. So he kind of had to sort of hide around the side of the stage because people were just like hassling him really. And yeah, by the time we came to play, we'd been drinking for about 4 or 5 hours, so all of us were like sort of quite drunk. And about halfway through, I'd noticed that Graham was kind of signalling to Andy and pointing to Pete's guitar, and apparently he wanted to get up and play with us. Which would have been fantastic for our profile, but probably not for the people who paid to come and see a half decent band play. So luckily Pete is left-handed and all his guitars are strung accordingly. So even Graham couldn't play a guitar upside down, but he was quite keen to give it a go though.
With this whole thing about drinking on stage and drinking before gigs and stuff is something that you kind of learn your lesson on, don't you? I mean, in terms of we did it all the time, and then I think my trousers nearly fell down at a gig in Southampton, and you get promoters coming to the front of the stage saying, you do need to get off right now because we do have other bands to come on, and you would just be sort of merrily playing along. And but yeah, I kind of think it's one of those rites of passage, though, isn't it, for any kind of like young band to just sort of get slaughtered. But usually I think I used to put it down to nerves really, because when you're thrust in that situation and you've got other bands playing on the bill and they potentially are a lot better than you, I think that's when, for me, that's when I used to drink too much. I think it's just through just sheer I was just petrified.
I think it was, as I said at the top, I mean there was a certain amount of Dutch courage when I started out, but then after that show, we introduced no more than 3 pints before playing. And like I say, if you're sitting, if you're playing if you are playing in Bath, or you're playing in Southampton, or you're in Edinburgh or something, and you're sound checking late afternoon, and then you've got 5 or 6 hours to kill, and you're in a pub, it's really difficult. But nothing's open, you can go and get something to eat or whatever, and then what, just sort of wander around Bath for like 3 hours. But I think eventually, as you say, every band comes to that realization. But I have to say, the scene, for want of a better word, was quite a boozy one. It was you would go and see bands like regularly playing absolutely plastered, because everyone, a lot of people thought it was the thing to do, sort of as Britpop kind of morphed into a more kind of laddie, sort of boozy, sort of football-y type of sort of crowd. I mean, it was almost expected that the lead singer would be just as drunk as the crowd was.
But how did the band kind of come to an end?
Well, we never really sort of split up. I think we just, again, I think maybe it was because we were, we did have quite a few years experience of the industry before we got signed. I think, we could tell that the focus had shifted. It was just people stopped coming to the gigs. It was difficult to get any coverage. It was difficult to get radio play, and also our record label were kind of had never really stepped up to the plate with regards to promotion and stuff. They wanted us to do an album. We didn't have an offer from anyone else, so we kind of went with them. I think the budget for the album was just as much as it was for one of the EPs. So we had to sort of get 12 songs out of the same amount of money that we used to have to get 4. I think when you join a band, you think about getting signed, you think you've reached the top of a ladder, but what actually happens is you get a deal and then you're at the bottom of another ladder and you've got to climb that ladder. And I think we just didn't get very far on that second ladder, really. I think to my mind, it kind of changed overnight. All of a sudden, people didn't want interesting little sort of quirky pop bands anymore. They wanted big lumbering sort of 60s focused rock bands, and we just weren't one of those, you know. I mean, when we recorded the album, and you know, we tried to experiment a bit and do lots of different things, but yeah, it was just like nobody was interested. The record label wasn't interested. I mean, we were quite lucky that it was actually put out. I mean, I know quite a few bands who recorded second albums and first albums that were never released. You know, like off the top of my head, I mean, I think like a band like Ballroom, for example. You know, they recorded an album that never came out. Menswear had a second album that I think only just came out in the UK last year or the year before. So yeah, I mean, all the air went out of it. I think I remember like Johnny from Menswear saying that, you know, as soon as the major labels kind of sniffed that there was a bit of money, they just basically hoovered up all the bands, hoovered up all the indie labels, and then when they didn't get the return they wanted, they just walked away, and which, you know, decimated the independent label sector and left loads of bands with, you know, sort of albums that they'd recorded that nobody wanted to put out. So it was kind of like a bloodbath, really, I think, for a lot of bands.
You got material though that you kind of thinking that you might do something with next year, is that right?
Well, yeah. Well, this has been sort of like dragging on for ages, really. I mean, what happened was that, you know, I mean, like the album came out, nothing happened with it, and we realised that we needed to have a bit of a rethink. So we kind of, but you know, by that point we were like, I think we were a 7-piece. We had like a 2-piece brass section, the keyboard player, as well as the 4 of us. So we sort of slimmed down to a 3-piece and started demoing for a second album. And you know, we had a little bit of interest from a couple of labels here and there, but nothing ever happened. So I think like Andy had started playing with Spearmint, and Pete was playing with the 4 Stories, which was the guys from Thurman's new band. And you know, we just kind of just parked everything. I went to university. I sort of started a career in journalism, and you know, we had a bunch of songs and they just kind of sat on the shelf, really. And then I guess around about 2005, I think, like Andy got a deal with Acid Jazz, and so a few of those songs that we demoed went on his first couple of albums. And then in 2008, Andy joined Paul Weller's band, and you know, that actually created a bit more interest in what he'd done previously, and obviously part of what he'd done previously was Pimlico. So you know, we started doing a few bits and pieces and always saying that we were going to put something out. But the first thing that came out was the Red Inspectors album. So the Red Inspectors were Pimlico plus a keyboard player called Alex Lee Richards, who played with the Blue Tones. And an album, but virtually an instrumental album. There were a couple of vocal tracks. An album came out on Acid Jazz, and we did a couple of shows to support that, including a really great show at the Borderline. And then in 2012, Andy wanted to take his solo stuff out on the road. So we went out as the Andy Lewis Experience, and that had myself and Mark Morris from the Blue Tones and Andy Ellison from John's Children and Jess Roberts on vocals. And that was really good. That was like a rolling review show, you know, with different singers and lots of different cover versions. And then sort of following on from that, I mean, Andy and I put a single out in 2012 called The Best of Days, which was an old Pimlico song that we resurrected and re-recorded. That came out on Acid Jazz. And yeah, so you know, we've had things sort of come out over the years, and we've been to Weller's studio, Black Barn, and we've recorded some more stuff. So yeah, we've got tons of stuff on the shelf, but it's just kind of, you know, getting the wherewithal to get it finished and to kind of decide what channel to put it out there, you know, because we are used to putting stuff out physically, and we're used to having, you know, sort of like a physical object for people to own. So we have put some stuff up on Bandcamp, and you know, some stuff is up on streaming sites, but I don't know, it doesn't really feel real to me unless it's, you know, been pressed up on vinyl.
Yeah, but that's kind of like
old-fashioned attitude.
But that's the kind of thing that is so popular at the moment, is bands, looking at archive stuff or just releasing stuff in vinyl or other medium or physical media, and then putting a little bit more effort into other aspects of it that they probably wouldn't have been able to do, many years ago. And
that's what happened last year, was when Martin Green put a compilation together called Supersonics, 40 junk shop Britpop greats, he chose our track Revolve and put that on there with people like the Weekenders and David Devon and Menswear, and it was a really good little compilation that basically sort of showed that pre-Oasis, kind of like laddie Britpop side of things, where Britpop came from, which is, it came from Blow Up, it came from Club Smashing, and it had a real art school kind of background feel to it. And I think sometimes that when people talk about Britpop, that kind of thing is lost. I think it was a really interesting arty little scene. It was very inclusive, it's very diverse. It was there were a lot of women involved in those early days of Britpop, not just in the clubs but with the bands as well. I think it was that kind of thing is slightly overlooked when people talk about it being this kind of like boozy laddish thing. Like to my mind, it wasn't that at all. It became that, but to me, that's something different.
Is there a chance we might get a pressing then in 2022?
Well, I would like to do something with it. It's because it's just sitting there. I've done a few sort of like radio interviews and where I've sort of sent some of the new songs and they've been played and that kind of thing. I just think it's we could stick it all up on Bandcamp or something, but I don't know, it just seems like it can fall through the cracks there. So even if we sort of put it up on streaming services, I think we'd want to get some kind of campaign behind it just to let people know that it's up there, or else it just gets lost. But there is an album's worth of material that needs to be sort of finished off, and when that does happen, I would like to put it out under the Pimlico name, because it is the four of us. But I guess it's just waiting for a time when we can all commit to promoting it. But whether that's 2022 or 2032, I don't know. It's we'll have to wait for some suitable anniversary, I guess.
Well, it's been fantastic to speak to you, Wesley, about Pimlico and everything you've been up to, and thanks so much for sharing all the stories and anecdotes of your time with the band, and obviously looking forward to hearing new stuff. Fingers crossed.
Well, thank you for asking me to come on. It's been it's been a good workout for the memory. Whenever I sort of talk about this, like the main thing I try to get across is that it was such a vibrant time. It was a really, really exciting time. Like before it kind of went mainstream, it was just, it was cheap to live in London. It was cheap to go out. You could go and see some really good bands. You can go to some really good clubs. You could be in a band and people would be quite happy to come and see you. It was just like really exciting. And I think it was like for me, I got a sense of, I'd kind of found the music that I should be playing. I think there's an element of, if you do want to have a career as a musician, you kind of chase things a little bit. But I think when this whole, what became Britpop kind of kicked off, like for me, it started with Suede. When I heard the Drowners, I was like, man, that sounds like Adam and the Ants, and it's like, I've not been as excited about something probably since Adam and the Ants had come out. And it was, the music we were making, it was really keyed into those bands we listened to when we were in our early teens, and I think that's what I found the most rewarding, is that I've managed to play the music that I would have loved to have listened to when I was 13 or 14. And that's what I'm the most proud of, I think, is that, I was kind of true to the music that I loved when I was a teenager. And I think a lot of bands were, it was the same with Blur. We're the same age as same age as them, same as Pulp or whatever. They weren't trying to be something or be somebody else. They were trying to be true to themselves. And I think that was a really exciting thing.
Massive thanks to Wesley for taking the time to speak to me on this episode. It was a really fascinating insight into what it was like to be in a band, in that scene, in that moment. So there's loads of ways you can support the podcast. It would be fantastic if you could do any one of these things. Support me on social media. So just search for Back to Britpop on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. If you want to contribute financially, that is also amazing because it costs a little bit of money to run the podcast, and you can do that by buying me a virtual coffee, and there's a link in the show notes to this episode. Also, what else really helps, and I know I keep banging on about this, but it is true, if you can go to the Apple Podcast app or the Apple Podcast desktop site and give a 5-star rating if you think the podcast is worth 5 stars, obviously. 4 stars is great, but 5 stars is better. And if you've got time, do a little review. That triggers something in the algorithms of Apple, and it just bumps the podcast up and potentially gets it seen by a bigger audience. But your support has been amazing so far, and I'm so chuffed that everyone's tuning in and all listening every week or whenever these episodes get put out. It's an absolute pleasure to do them, and long may it continue. So I'll stop waffling. That's my favourite thing to do. Thanks again, and hope to see you on the next episode. Take care.